The Old Testament book of Ezekiel is a really interesting book. The book opens, you find Ezekiel having been taken captive from his homeland back in Jerusalem. The Babylonian army has come and taken many of the Israelites captive and back to the land of Babylon. Ezekiel was one of those. He finds himself in a faraway land, a strange land, a land that is full of idol worship. And here he is, taken in his mid-20s and in this situation. Ezekiel finds himself some 5 years later beside a river, and God will appear to Ezekiel in a vision. And in this vision he actually sees God on his throne there in Babylon. This is probably a little confusing to Ezekiel because God doesn't dwell in Babylon. Ezekiel knew that God's presence dwelt in the temple back in Jerusalem, there where the Ark of the Covenant was. Ezekiel knew this, and so it was interesting to Ezekiel, what is God doing here? God has come to Ezekiel to call him to be a priest. He has come all the way to this land of Babylon, far away from Jerusalem, to call him to be a priest. And the reason he is doing this is because his people in Israel, they have become wicked. They have digressed into idol worship themselves, to the point where they have set up idols there in the courtyard of the temple. And God is calling Ezekiel to be a priest, to be a watchman for them. And that's actually what you find in chapter 3 and chapter 33 of the book of Ezekiel. There is a section there where God is calling Ezekiel to be a watchman. This watchman will have a very specific purpose. What it is that Ezekiel is supposed to do, he is to warn the people. God tells him that if you will warn the people, then their sin will not be upon you. But if you fail to warn them, then I will require their guilt at your hands. Simply said, if Ezekiel would watch for the people and warn them of their wicked ways, then they would be responsible for their own actions. God has chosen Ezekiel for a very specific role. He is to be that watchman for Israel. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 9, we learn that we as God's people today in the New Testament era, we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we are called to be priests. As a matter of fact, when you read through those passages in 1 Peter chapter 2, you will find that we are not only priests, but we are called a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a chosen people. You see, God has chosen each one of us to be a priest. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, you learn that the Spirit of God today actually dwells inside of each Christian individual. And this is so interesting to think about ourselves as priests of God, ourselves as the embodiment. We have God's Spirit living inside of us, and everywhere we go, we have God's Spirit within us. Very much differently than what we see in the Old Testament. God's Spirit now dwells within us. In Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20, Jesus will remind his followers there of their mission, of what it is that they are supposed to do. They, for years, have been following Jesus around, seeing all the wonderful things that he did, listening to all the wonderful things that he taught, and they themselves have been teaching the message of Christ. And now Jesus is going to say to them, it is now your job. You must go into all the nations. You must go into all the world. And as you go into the world, you are to make disciples, teaching them about the gospel of Christ. Mark chapter 16, verses 15 and 16 says it like this: "Go into all the world and preach the gospel of the kingdom." You see, Jesus chose his disciples to be the ones that take this gospel, that takes this good news into the world. How very special that is. That we, each one of us, as God's people, He chose us to deliver a very special message. Much like Ezekiel, we are chosen to be the ones who take a very special message of God's love and God's grace into the world. Beginning in chapter 13, this is the Thursday evening. Before He will be crucified on Friday, you have the last few hours of Jesus' life there. And from 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, this all records this time that Jesus will be there with His disciples in the upper room before He will be crucified on that Friday. In John chapter 15, verse 8, Jesus will say this, as He has been telling the disciples there about the vine and the branches, and as He says, "I am the vine and you are the branches." John 15 and verse 8, Jesus says this, "Here is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit." You see, God is glorified when we bear much fruit. Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through 9 says it best. He also spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of the vineyard, "Look, for 3 years I've come seeking fruit on the fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground?" But he answered and said to him, "Sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit, well, but if not, after that you shall cut it down." I love this short little parable because it has so much information in just a few verses. You see, Jesus is telling us that we should bear fruit. I heard a story a number of years ago of a person that visited California. And there in California, they visited the San Joaquin Valley and they visited a vineyard. And as they conversed with the farmers there in the vineyard, they were talking about how they had the vineyard laid out. That vineyard was laid out into certain grids. And the farmers expected a certain yield from each grid. They expected to get 50 pounds of grapes per vine per year. If in any one particular year a farmer did not receive the yield that he expected, they would come in and do some very special things to it. They would fertilize it. They would do everything that it needed to be productive. The next year, if that grid did not produce the fruit that was expected, they did something very interesting. They came in and they would cut all the vines down and start all over again. And see, this makes sense to me because the farmers of the San Joaquin Valley are not in the vine growing business. They are in the fruit producing business. God has called each one of us as priests, as His people, to have a very special message, to bear fruit, to be fruitful, and to glorify God. Won't you stay evangelistic?